meeting with the central bank guys, not one meeting where they were putting the red lights on. Not one meeting. And never did Brian Cowen or the finance officials come over to me to say that the whole thing, the bottom, was going to fall out. Now, I know Bertie. That is so much his true and authentic voice. But it also shows his cleverness. It is a crushing indictment of the Department of Finance. It is a crushing indictment of the central bank. It is a crushing indictment of his anointed heir and successor, Brian Cowen. And that's the voice he wishes to leave on the history book records. Never a man not to get his retaliation in and to explain it in his own way. And you know, it's crony capitalism that brought us to this. That golden circle of Fianna Fáil, the Lord of Misrule in the Galway tent, the bankers like Shawnee Fitzpatrick, who lectured, he gave a lecture, an actual lecture, a year or so before we began to become familiar in a way that none of us could ever have wished with the inner workings of the Anglo-Irish Bank, in which Mr. Fitzpatrick, as became a mega-billionaire, lectured us that financial regulation in Ireland was the new McCarthyism. Shortly afterwards, he lectured the Irish government that old age pensioners and others should take cuts and cuts and cuts. Now, we were all young and naive then, back in the early days of the financial crisis and the collapse of the banks. Although I predicted the collapse of the bubble, although I was the first person to raise the Quinn affair, the contracts for difference, the property-based tax breaks, it's all on my record in the Dáil, I must say, I never thought that the wrongdoings and the bust model of Anglo would also actually bring down not only AIB, but possibly also the Bank of Ireland. Because as of this week, despite all its efforts, despite the rights issue, it's almost back to where it was before, and it gives me no pleasure to say it. But there's the voice of Bertie. He comes in and he votes here, but he never speaks. But he does, on his paid lectures, tell the world. And Brian Cowen told him nothing. The finance officials told him nothing. The central bank told him nothing. So what Bertie is saying here is, what would a manager in any company do? They'd say, sack the lot of them. You've brought such incredible destruction to your country. Where is the honour? Where is the honour? And I think this is what faces Brian Cowen more than anybody else. Where is the honour of continuing when you created this disaster? And although as early as 2006, when I had a very big argument with Brian Cowen over contracts for difference and turning the Dublin Stock Exchange into a casino, little did I know that today Paddy Power, the bookmakers, is a bigger element on the Irish Stock Exchange than our banks. Doesn't that tell it all about the Celtic tiger turned into the Celtic tortoise? Doesn't it tell it all? And that is why people are so angry. David McWilliams, in his book about the Pope's children and in his recent book about the crash, talks about insiders and outsiders in this country, and in his recent one-man show. And in a way, this 4-year plan is about the insiders and the outsiders. The outsiders are the little people. The outsiders are the people who have endless capacity and endless energy to take it on the chin. The outsiders are the people who can have a cut in the minimum wage. But there's no requirement as a quid pro quo that their bosses, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, and the minimum wage is mostly a matter in the private sector, should also limit their compensation package on a parallel with what people on the lowest wage are being asked to take. I went during the Dublin Theatre Festival to see a play in the Gaiety called Enron by a London company. And Enron told the story of this massive energy company which became one of the biggest financial empires in the United States, and which, in its destruction, has brought, among others, the state of California close to financial ruin. But the state of California is in the continental US federal system, so the state of California won't bring down the dollar, even though it's one of the biggest states. But the story of Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, the chief accountant and the chief executive and the chief accountant. You know, the audience that night in the Gaiety was mostly young people, I think from banks and insurance companies and business houses, going to the theatre after work. And you know, there was a fantastic atmosphere of excitement in the theatre. And at the end of the play, the chief character, Jeffrey Skilling, the accountant who organised the tricky things with the books to inflate the books of Enron and make it a bubble company, just like our bubble economy. He's in an orange jumpsuit, and he's obviously in jail, where he's going to spend a lot of time. And you know, you could feel in the audience this massive wave of emotion, because that outcome in Ireland, because of the way we have run this crony capitalism, is unimaginable. That's the problem. There is no Madoff moment in Ireland. There's no Enron, Jeffrey Skilling moment in Ireland. The lords of misrule, they have their houses in Marbella, they have their little tax bolt holes in Switzerland. They are around the world. They are around the world. They're in the pricier parts of Connecticut and New England, starting afresh. Or they come back for the odd, match and so on, like our tax exiles. Our tax exiles don't merit even a little note, leaving a little note in the Green Book yesterday of the 4-year plan. They don't even merit a note. It's the little people who have to give, who'll take it on the chin, while the people who lectured us and who continue to lecture us will have the luxury of not actually having to do their share of the heavy lifting. And you know, what is the attitude of the Irish negotiators to the European Central Bank, to the European Commission, and to the IMF? Can I just say this? I, like many Irish people, have had a very strange experience recently. And you can try this yourself. Obviously, I have been texting people because I've been doing a lot of work looking into the IMF and the way their structures work. And you know, when I do IMF on predictive text, do you know what comes up first? God. God comes up first on the predictive text. And you know, we need to think as a country. Of course, we have to have a rescue plan. We need rescuers and helpers, but we also need to be emotionally and mentally and intellectually tough in relation to the negotiations. And I look at this sorry set of ministers, and you know, they're mostly feeling sorry for themselves, not the rest of us. I mean, I see real emotion and pain etched on many, many faces, but in many cases it's for themselves. And I wonder about their capacity to negotiate a tough deal on behalf of this country. You know, I think that some people in the Department of Finance, and probably the Minister for Finance, has been hanging out a little bit too long and too familiarly with Jean-Paul Trichet, Mr. Trichet. I've listened to him speaking in Dublin. I've listened to them all speaking in Dublin. You know, as a country, of course we have made terrible mistakes. But if they think that they can make Ireland a poster child for punishment by international finance agencies, by destroying this country, by terms of negotiation which are impossible to deal with, like the Germans after the Versailles Treaty, they will rue the day when they did that to this country, and they set that as an example for Europe and for the Eurozone. And I think they need to pause before they decide to make Ireland a poster child for punishment, because Ireland will not be able to pay these debts unless, and let me say this to the men from the IMF and from the ECB and from the Commission, Ireland needs cheap money. It needs money at cheap rates of interest if it is going to have a chance to pay back, which Irish people wish to do and commit to do, the sort of financial advances which are being made to us. We can apologise for having a government which has dealt so ineptly with the blanket bank guarantee. I'm sure the IMF are appalled to find that the room for manoeuvre in relation to the bondholders is probably very limited because of the blanket bank guarantee. The statement yesterday on the 4-year recovery plan, what's the ghost at the feast? What's the ghost like Hamlet's father, you know, stalking the edges, the perimeters of the plan? The ghost is the banks and the bank debts that are on our shoulders. And I want to say this particularly to people in the Eurozone. Please do not make this, it seems now, like a 4 or a 5-act tragedy. Act 1 was Greece. Act 2 is Ireland. Act 3 may be Portugal. And then, worst of all, for the strategists in the Eurozone, Act 4 could be Spain. I think we need a serious discussion about this. People from Europe may say, who is a member of the Irish Parliament, given the state that the country is in, to even dare to question us? But I would say that solidarity is a founding principle of the European Union and the union that I support, and solidarity is a two-way street. I think that Mrs. Merkel really does have a very good point in relation to bondholders bearing parts of the debts, and she has clarified those statements to refer to the time after 2013. But what Mrs. Merkel has to say on that is essentially sensible and reasonable, that if you have a bank that collapses, that not just the shareholders who in Ireland lost their shirts totally, but also the bondholders who are risk takers should share in the losses. I think that Mrs. Merkel's statement, although I hear people here complaining that that statement fluttered the bond markets. I mean, the difficulty with the bond markets is that, of course, if you say there's going to be pain for the bond markets, they will react by repricing up the interest rates on your debt. Of course they're going to do that. They're the epitome of market forces. Market forces red in tooth and claw. And those market forces at the moment, many of them are prepared to take a punt on the destruction of the euro. And I think they're probably making an awful lot of money. They made an awful lot of money on Greece. I'm quite sure there are people counting their hundreds of millions that they made in Ireland, and they are stalking the Eurozone to see where they can strike next. I think it is time for the people in charge of the Eurozone to think about strategies that not only maintain countries like Ireland, but also maintain the Eurozone, because unless they can do both, the Eurozone, in my view, will have a very problematical future. And I think the Eurozone, on balance, up to the current debacle, has actually been good for Ireland. About the interest rates, the United Kingdom and the Foreign Minister of Sweden, or the Finance Minister of Sweden, both mentioned rates of 3%. The IMF, the fund, normally lends at rates of around 3.2%, as I understand it currently. These are the kind of rates of interest that Ireland requires to have in terms of its debt. Ireland also needs to spread some of this over a longer period. The Labour Party has staked a position which I know is not popular with either Fianna Fáil, the Greens or the PDs, and I know is under consideration now by Fine Gael. And that is that if you front-load too much austerity, you get this momentary approval from the markets around the front-loading of the austerity. But the difficulty is the front-loading of the austerity, if it is accompanied by penal rates of interest, will sink the country. And if they do the same in other countries, in this 3 or 4 act tragedy of the peripheral countries, it will actually then have a 5th act, and that will be the destruction of the euro. So let's pause and think about what is not only in Ireland's interest, but what is in the mutual interest of the Eurozone and the euro as a currency. Can I just say, moving to the contents of the report, one thing that a lot of people have said to me is that one of the suggestions in the report in relation to labour market reforms is a 10% reductions for new entrants to the public service. Now, I think the government and all the parties in this House should clarify that at the next election, that does include TDs, and that at the next election or after the next election, that does...
Time is expired, I'll allow some text.
At the next election or after the next election, that does include the incoming government. That's a personal view of mine. I know that many of my party colleagues share it. I know it's something that people have to think about. But you can't load pain on, young people coming into the public service and then say that the people at the top of the public service are in the same, are somehow or other, by some kind of clever thing, exempt from it. I agree that there needs to be measures in the social welfare system that encourage people to get back to work. I agree with that, because you cannot have a system where young people are encouraged to see life on the dole as some kind of permanent position. When I was in social welfare, when Labour was last in government, we created the Back to Work scheme. We created a whole series of returns to health, to education, to training, to work in the community. A lot of that was done away with during the years of the Celtic Tiger, and the feeling was left by agencies like FÁS that the people who are on the unemployment register were somehow unfit for work. We have to change all of that. We have extraordinarily well-qualified people on the register now, many of them with fine professional qualifications. It's the challenge for us and the smart economy, which is mentioned in this document, is to think smart about how those people can contribute. We've suggested graduate internship schemes. We've suggested various return to work experience schemes. I think everything like that has to be activated. We've suggested in relation to rents that rents should be reviewable downward as well as upward. There's a hint of that in the document, but it's not spelled out. Obviously, the government has refrained from spelling out the details of the tax and the pension changes, but I'll finish on this. I remember being on a debate not so long ago with Dermot Ahern, and I talked about the property-based tax breaks being capable of producing, in my view, over a couple of years, 800 million in savings. And you know, Dermot Ahern got, as he does, you know, a bit annoyed. And he said, oh, no. He had advice from the Attorney General that this was impossible. Now, I am very glad that winding down of tax breaks is finally acknowledged and included in this document. That is a bipartisan move on the part of the government, which I welcome. There does have to be a new kind of bipartisan politics in which there is robust debate, but also people like some of the ministers who have been in government for 13 years, they do have to acknowledge that the monopoly of wisdom is not held by Fianna Fáil, and that Fianna Fáil now have to yield to others. And they have to acknowledge that our ideas have merit. We, after all, called it and advised Fianna Fáil correctly on the bank guarantee. For their own reasons, they didn't accept that advice. One last thing can I say, I was talking to somebody from Greece the other day. I think that people in Ireland can be very robust in their opposition to any or all of the measures. That's a democratic right. But can I plead with people, please do not be photo fodder for some of the international media who are stalking around, you know, Dublin and various buildings. Ireland is not just ghost estates. Ireland is not just piebald ponies let run in fields, even though those images are appealing. In Greece, the impact of the kind of violence that happened has really damaged their tourism trade. Tourism is a really important earner in this country, and it will be something that will help the country to recover. So I would appeal particularly to people in some of the smaller political organisations, and I do know that some people are mad as hell and they don't want to take it anymore. But don't simply be used as photographic fodder to present the worst image of Ireland. You know, there are good things about Ireland. We're in a difficult place, but we have great people in this country, and we will recover. Mind you, our administration is acting like the Hoover administration in the Great Depression. We need a Rooseveltian administration that will produce a new deal for this country and that will help the country to recover.